The morning sun rose slowly over the massive training reserve, its golden light spilling across endless steel fences and echo domes that shimmered in the mist. Inside one of those domes stood Instructor Mason, calm and focused, his eyes scanning the row of young recruits standing stiffly before him. The air buzzed with tension and fear. Everyone had heard stories about these training sessions, how one mistake could cost a life. "Remember," Mason said firmly, his voice steady, "you don't control them with strength, you control them with calm." He stepped closer to a reinforced gate that led to the holding area. Behind it, shadows moved, slow, deliberate, dangerous. "Today," he continued, "we meet the next generation of apex predators." The gate hissed open, and the sound that followed made every trainee freeze, a deep, throaty growl, low and intelligent. Out of the dim light came a creature unlike anything they'd seen before. It moved like a cat, but had the shoulders of a bear, fur patterned with black and silver, and eyes glowing faint gold. "Meet Echo," Mason said softly, "our first hybrid cub. Remember, it's still young, but never underestimate an apex." The recruits whispered nervously. "It looks aware," one said under his breath. "It is aware," Mason replied, never taking his eyes off the creature. "It's half instinct, half design." Mason raised his hand, slowly kneeling to meet the cub's gaze. "Good," he whispered. "Easy now, Echo." The creature tilted its head curiously, muscles tensed but calm. For a moment, there was peace, the kind of fragile balance that could break with a single breath. Then a high-pitched hum filled the dome. The recruits flinched. Mason frowned and tapped his earpiece. "Control, is that feedback from the speaker?" No one answered. The hum grew louder, sharper, almost invisible, but pulsing in their bones. Echo's ears twitched. Its eyes turned from gold to bright, unnatural blue. Mason's instincts screamed. "Everyone step back!" he shouted, but it was too late. The cub exploded forward like lightning. Mason saw only a flash of claws and teeth before pain exploded through his face. The world blurred. He heard a sickening crack, then silence. "Mason's down!" A trainee screamed. "Sedate it! Sedate it!" Red lights flashed, alarms blared, and the dome filled with chaos. Darts fired from the walls, striking the cub's flank. Echo roared, knocking over a table and smashing equipment before collapsing in a trembling heap. Mason lay still, blood pouring down his chin. "Get medics!" Someone shouted, "He's still breathing!" Two soldiers rushed in with stretchers, and as they lifted him, his half-conscious eyes locked onto Echo. For just a second, through the blur of pain, he saw something he couldn't explain, fear in the creature's eyes. Almost like guilt, hours later Mason woke in the medical bay. His jaw was wired shut, pain searing through every nerve. The steady beeping of machines filled the room. A nurse adjusted his IV, whispering, "You're lucky, sir. That thing could have killed you." He couldn't reply, only blink weakly. The door opened, and Dr. Lyra stepped in, his assistant, a quiet woman with sharp eyes. She looked pale, holding a datapad close. "Mason," she said in a low voice, "I saw the footage. It wasn't random. The cub was calm until that sound began." He tried to mumble a question, but his voice was a muffled groan. "No, don't try to talk," she said, pulling a small tablet from her pocket. "Look, on the screen the video replayed the moment before the attack." Echo sat still, breathing slowly. Then the strange sound began, a faint high-frequency pulse. The cub's pupils contracted, its muscles tightening before it struck. "That's not instinct," Lyra whispered. "That's a command signal. Someone triggered it." Mason's eyes widened. He scribbled shakily on a notepad, "Find who did it." She nodded grimly. "I will, but the higher-ups already gave the order to destroy the creature. They called it unstable." He grabbed her hand, forcing his gaze into hers. His eyes said what his mouth couldn't. "Don't let them." That night, the base was quiet except for the wind howling through the towers. Inside a secured laboratory, Lyra slipped past sleeping guards, her ID card trembling in her hand. She entered the data vault and typed Mason's clearance code. The room filled with glowing files and encrypted folders. Her eyes darted over names until she found one marked Project Apex Rebirth. She opened it and froze. The files revealed that Echo wasn't a training experiment. It was part of a classified weaponization project designed to respond to hidden voice commands from top officials. "They built it to obey," she whispered, "not to learn." Then she saw the timestamp seconds before the attack, marked "Remote Activation Received." Her stomach twisted. Someone high up had used the cub to test how far they could push it, even if it meant breaking the instructor in front of witnesses. Lyra copied the files onto a data chip and slipped it into her coat. A red warning light flickered above the door. Security detected an intrusion. "No, not now," she whispered, running through the dark corridors. Footsteps echoed behind her. Guards shouted, "Stop! Unauthorized access!" She darted into the infirmary, her heart pounding. Mason stirred awake as she knelt beside him, sweat dripping down her face. "They know," she whispered urgently, slipping the chip into his medical brace. "They'll destroy everything." "Don't trust anyone." The door burst open. Guards stormed in, flashlights blinding. "Step away from the patient." One ordered. Lyra raised her hands, forcing a calm smile. "I was just checking his vitals," she said softly. The guard scanned her ID and nodded. "You have clearance, but be quick." They left, and she exhaled shakily. Mason's eyes met hers again. She whispered one last time, "They planned this. They used you. But I'll expose them." When the lights dimmed and the guards were gone, Mason lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His jaw throbbed, his body ached, but none of that mattered. All he could see was Echo's glowing blue eyes and the haunting truth behind them. Someone wanted him silenced, but they forgot one thing. Mason wasn't the kind of man to give up, and somewhere, in a locked cell at the far end of the base, the predator cub opened its eyes again. Its golden color had returned. It blinked slowly as if waiting for someone. For Mason, because the bond between man and beast wasn't broken by pain. It had only just begun. The rain came hard that night, turning the training base into a blur of grey mist and flickering lights. Inside the medical bay, Instructor Mason sat awake, the machines around him beeping softly. His jaw was still wired, his face bruised and swollen, but his mind was sharp. He could not speak, so his thoughts screamed silently inside his head. The strange attack, the hum, the blue glow in the cub's eyes. It all repeated over and over. Something didn't fit. He could still feel that moment, the creature's fear, its confusion. It hadn't wanted to hurt him. It was made to. The door opened quietly, and Dr. Lyra slipped in again, her coat wet from the rain. She closed the door behind her and whispered, "We don't have much time. They're transferring Echo to the lower labs at dawn. After that, he's gone." Mason looked at her with a mix of anger and desperation. She pulled a small tablet from her bag. "I decoded part of the data I took last night," she said, setting it beside his bed. "You were right. Someone triggered that signal during training. The logs show it came from Command Tower 3, one of the restricted buildings." Mason's eyes narrowed. He grabbed a pen and scribbled on his notepad, "Who is in Tower 3? She hesitated, biting her lip. "Director Corrin," she said softly. "He's the one who oversees Project Apex. If he finds out what I've done, I'll disappear before sunrise." Mason's hand froze. Corrin, the man who gave him this job, the one who said the hybrids were meant to protect humanity. He wrote, "Why would he use Echo to attack me?" Lyra shook her head. "Maybe you were getting too close to the truth. Maybe they needed a failure to justify weaponizing them. I don't know. But I do know this. They've wiped all surveillance data except the copy I made. Without it, no one will believe us." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver key card. "This gives you access to the sub-level tunnels. If we're going to save that creature and expose what they're doing, we need to move tonight." Mason stared at the card. His hands trembled slightly. He nodded once. Lyra smiled faintly. "I knew you'd say that," she said, then leaned closer, lowering her voice. "But you need to understand something, Mason. Echo isn't just any predator. He's the first one that learned empathy. That's why they fear him." Hours later, when the guards changed shifts and the corridors fell silent, Lyra returned with a small transport chair. "You ready?" she whispered. Mason nodded, pulling the blanket aside. He was weak but determined. Together they slipped through the dim halls, moving past silent rooms filled with glass tanks and humming machines. The deeper they went, the colder it became. Finally, they reached a heavy steel door marked Containment Bay 9. Lyra swiped the card. The door hissed open, and the smell of antiseptic and metal filled the air. Inside the chamber, Echo lay on the floor behind thick glass walls, eyes half closed, body strapped with restraints. The once powerful cub now looked broken, sedatives pumping through tubes connected to its neck. Mason stepped closer, his eyes full of guilt. "He recognizes you," Lyra whispered, watching as Echo's gaze flicked toward Mason. The creature made a soft, low sound, almost like a whine. "It's okay," she said gently, typing on a nearby control pad. "I can disable the sedative line, but once I do, alarms will trigger. We'll have 3 minutes before security arrives." Mason wrote quickly on a note, "Do it." Lyra nodded, pressing the sequence. The sound of hissing gas filled the room. Echo's breathing changed, faster, deeper. His muscles tightened, eyes glowing faintly gold again. "Stay calm, boy," Lyra said softly. Mason stepped forward, pressing his hand against the glass. Echo tilted his head, then pushed back weakly. The connection between them felt almost human. Suddenly red lights flashed above them. A voice boomed through the speakers. "Unauthorized access detected. Security en route," Lyra cursed. "They're faster than I thought." She slammed a lever down, and the glass enclosure opened. Echo stumbled out, shaky but alert. Mason limped forward, motioning for it to follow. The creature sniffed the air, then moved beside him, low and tense. "This way!" Lyra shouted, leading them through a back tunnel. Alarms wailed behind them. "Stop them!" a voice yelled from a distant hallway. Gunfire echoed. Mason turned, shielding Lyra as bullets sparked against metal walls. Echo roared and leapt toward the guards, moving with terrifying grace. In seconds, the hall went silent except for the hum of cooling vents. Lyra's hands shook. "He didn't kill them," she whispered in disbelief. "He just disarmed them. He's learning." They reached a maintenance door leading to the outer perimeter. Lyra entered the final code, but before it could open, a deep voice echoed from behind. "Going somewhere, Doctor?" They froze. Director Corran stepped from the shadows, flanked by armed soldiers. His face was calm, almost amused. "I warned you not to let your emotions interfere with progress," he said coldly. Mason glared, fury burning in his eyes. Corran smirked. "Ah, the famous instructor Mason. Still alive, I see. You should have stayed down. You could have been part of history." Lyra stood between them. "You turned living creatures into weapons," she said, voice trembling but fierce. "You made Echo attack him just to prove your theory." Corran chuckled. "They are tools, Doctor. Tools that will win wars. But you two," he pointed to Mason and the cub, "your liabilities." He raised his hand. "End this." Before the soldiers could fire, Echo let out a roar that shook the walls. Lights exploded. The creature leapt forward, shielding Mason and Lyra as bullets tore through the air. Sparks and smoke filled the corridor. Mason dragged Lyra through the side hatch as Echo slammed into a guard, disarming him effortlessly. Corran shouted orders, but his voice was lost in the chaos. The emergency door sealed shut behind Mason and Lyra as they stumbled into the rain outside. They turned back just in time to see the building's upper floors flash with fire. Lyra gasped, covering her mouth. "He's still in there," she whispered, tears mixing with rain. "He saved us." Mason stared at the burning base, the orange flames reflecting in his eyes. He knew Echo wasn't dead. He couldn't be. Somewhere in that fire, the creature that had once been his student and his attacker was fighting its way to freedom. Far away, in the forest beyond the base, cameras caught a shadow moving through the trees, glowing faintly gold in the darkness. And though no one at the base believed it, Mason did. The predator they feared had just proven it was more human than any of them. The morning after the explosion, smoke still hung in the air above the ruined training base. Fire crews and drones searched the wreckage while soldiers moved through the ash, whispering that no one had survived. But miles away, deep inside the forest, Instructor Mason sat beside a small campfire with Dr. Lyra. His face was pale, his jaw still stiff, and his eyes fixed on the horizon. The forest was silent, except for the soft hum of distant aircraft searching overhead. Lyra wrapped a blanket tighter around her shoulders. They'll blame us for this, she said quietly. Mason nodded slowly. He picked up a stick and drew a rough map in the dirt. He pointed to a mountain range marked with an old facility symbol. You think he went there? She asked. Mason gave a short nod. Lyra frowned. The decommissioned lab. It's been shut down for years. Mason scribbled a note on his pad and showed it to her. Echo knows the path. That's where they took him before training. Lyra sighed, rubbing her temples. Even if he's alive, Mason, the military won't stop. You saw Corin's face. He'll hunt that creature until it's dead. Mason's hand tightened on the notepad. Not creature, he wrote. Student. She stared at the word for a long moment. Student? She whispered. He almost killed you. Mason looked at her, eyes filled with calm conviction. He tapped his chest, then pointed toward the forest. Lyra understood. You felt it, she said softly. The connection. Before she could say more, the air filled with the low hum of a passing drone. They both froze. Move! She hissed, pulling him toward the trees. The drone's red light swept across the clearing. Mason grabbed her arm and pulled her into a small cave hidden behind thick roots. They stayed silent, breathing shallowly as the machine hovered, scanning the ground. Finally, it turned away and vanished into the clouds. Lyra slumped against the wall. We can't stay here, she said. We need to reach that lab before they do. Mason nodded and packed their few supplies. As they stepped back into the rain, she whispered, I hope you're right about him. By nightfall, they reached the edge of the old mountain facility. The place looked abandoned, rusted gates, broken windows, and ivy creeping across concrete walls. But the security scanners still worked, faint red lights blinking in the dark. Lyra knelt near a broken terminal and connected her handheld device. Still active, she muttered. Military grid. They've got remote sensors online. Mason scribbled, Can you disable them? She smiled faintly. You trained me, remember? After a few tense seconds, the lights flickered and died. We're in, she whispered. They slipped inside, boots crunching on the cracked floor. The air smelled of oil and dust. It's like a tomb, she murmured. Suddenly a low growl echoed through the corridor. Mason froze, signaling her to stay behind him. He raised a metal pipe, his muscles tense. From the shadows, two glowing golden eyes appeared. Lyra gasped. Echo, she whispered. The cub, now larger, stronger, stepped forward, tail low, body trembling. Its fur was burned in patches, but its gaze was alert, focused. He made it, she said, tears in her eyes. Mason lowered the pipe and took a slow step forward. Easy, he murmured through his wired jaw, the words barely audible. Echo tilted its head, sniffing the air. It took one hesitant step closer, then another, until it stood right before Mason. The creature's nose brushed his hand, and for the first time, its growl faded. Lyra smiled. He remembers you, she said softly. The moment of peace shattered when a voice boomed through the hallway speakers. You shouldn't have come here, Mason. Both of them turned sharply. Lyra whispered, Corin. The old speakers crackled again. You think you can hide? This facility has been under surveillance since the day it shut down. You led us right to the creature. Mason's heart pounded. Red lights flared across the ceiling as mechanical shutters began to close. He's locking us in, Lyra shouted, pulling at a control panel. Echo roared and lunged toward the wall, smashing through metal doors with raw power. Mason grabbed Lyra's arm and pulled her through before the blast doors sealed. Behind them, the hall exploded with gunfire. Soldiers poured in through the main entrance. Run! Lyra screamed as they sprinted down a side tunnel. The echo of boots and rifles followed them. Mason glanced back. Echo was covering their retreat, slamming soldiers aside, moving faster than any animal should. Bullets tore through the air, sparks flying from the walls. One grazed Lyra's shoulder and she stumbled. Mason caught her before she fell. Go! She shouted, blood on her sleeve. I'll hold them. He shook his head, pulling her forward. They reached a large chamber filled with dark water tanks and broken consoles. End of the line, she gasped. Mason looked around desperately. Then he saw a broken elevator shaft leading upward. He pointed. You can't be serious, she said. That thing hasn't worked in decades. He gestured again, firm this time. Before they could move, Corin's voice returned. You can't win, Mason. That creature is property. You think you're saving it, but you're just dooming yourselves." A shadow appeared in the upper walkway, Corran himself, holding a pistol. His uniform was soaked, his eyes burning with fury. "You had potential," he said coldly. "Now you're just another failure." He raised the gun and fired. Mason shoved Lyra aside, the bullet grazing his arm. Echo roared and leapt from the darkness, crashing into the walkway. Corran fired again, but the predator was faster. The platform collapsed, sending both falling into the chamber below. The water exploded in a spray of silver and red light as sparks rained from broken wires. "Mason!" Lyra shouted, running to the edge. She saw Echo dragging himself from the water, wounded but alive. There was no sign of Corran. Mason climbed out beside the creature, soaked and bleeding, his breath heavy. Lyra ran to him, gripping his hand. "We have to leave now," she said. "Backup will be here any second." He nodded weakly, glancing at Echo. The cub's eyes glowed faint gold again, and for a moment Mason could swear it understood everything that had happened as they escaped through the old ventilation shaft. The first rays of dawn broke through the clouds. Behind them, explosions tore through the mountain as the base's self-destruct system activated. From afar, helicopters circled the smoking ruins, broadcasting that the fugitives were dead. But miles away, through the morning fog, 3 silhouettes moved quietly through the forest. A man, a woman, and a predator walking side by side. Lyra looked back once, then whispered, "What happens now?" Mason didn't answer, only smiled faintly through his pain. He wrote a single word on his notepad: "Freedom." Echo turned its head, eyes gleaming in the sunlight. For the first time since it was created, it was no one's weapon. And for the first time, Mason realized he wasn't training a predator anymore. He was protecting a friend. The forest was calm that night, the moonlight filtering through the tall trees like silver mist. Mason sat near the fire, his bandaged arm resting on his knee, while Lyra cleaned her wound in silence. Echo lay beside them, his golden eyes reflecting the flames. The predator had grown stronger, its muscles thicker, its movements smoother, but its gaze was gentle whenever it looked at Mason. "He's changing," Lyra whispered, watching it carefully. Mason nodded slowly. He scribbled on his notepad, "He's learning faster than before." She frowned. "That's what worries me. He's not supposed to evolve this way. It's like he's thinking like us." Mason gave a small smile. "Maybe that's a good thing." The night wind rustled the leaves. In the distance, the faint hum of aircraft broke the quiet. Lyra looked up, fear in her eyes. "They're still searching," she said. "If they find us here, it's over." Mason threw dirt over the fire and motioned for her to pack. Echo stood instantly, alert, ears twitching. They moved through the trees, silent and careful, until they reached a rocky ridge overlooking a river. The water shimmered in the moonlight, calm but deep. "We can follow the river north," Lyra whispered. "There's an abandoned outpost near the cliffs. We can hide there." Mason nodded, but Echo suddenly growled low, sniffing the air. "What is it?" she asked. Before she finished speaking, a red light appeared on Mason's chest, a laser sight. "Down!" Lyra shouted. Bullets tore through the air, hitting the trees around them. Mason pulled her behind a fallen log as Echo roared, leaping into the darkness. The forest exploded with gunfire and screams. "They found us!" Lyra gasped, reloading her small pistol. Mason nodded, pointing to the river. "We jump?" she asked in disbelief. He nodded again. "You're insane," she muttered, but there was no other choice. He grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the edge. They leapt as Echo crashed through the trees behind them, diving into the black water just as an explosion lit up the forest above. The current was strong. Lyra struggled to stay afloat as the waves pulled her under. Mason grabbed her arm, kicking hard until they surfaced again. Echo swam beside them, his golden eyes glowing faintly through the dark water. They drifted for what felt like hours, until the current slowed, carrying them toward the old outpost by the cliffs. Exhausted, they crawled onto the muddy bank. Lyra coughed, shivering. "We can't keep running forever," she said quietly. Mason wrote on his pad, "We don't run. We expose them." She stared at the words. "Expose them? Mason, we don't even have proof anymore." The chip is gone. The file's burned. Mason shook his head and pointed to his arm brace. She frowned, then gasped as realization hit. You still have the backup. He nodded. Before they could speak again, a faint beep came from Lyra's wrist scanner. She checked the screen and froze. They've launched drones. 3 of them heading this way. Mason grabbed his pack and motioned toward a nearby cave. They ran inside, Echo following closely. The cave was dark and cold, but it hid them from sight. Outside, the hum of drones grew louder. Red searchlights swept across the river. Stay quiet, Lyra whispered. Echo crouched low, his breathing slow and steady. Mason held his breath as a beam of light passed right over the cave entrance, stopping for a long moment before moving on. Finally, the sound faded away. They waited another few minutes before stepping out. Lyra exhaled in relief. That was too close, she muttered. But before Mason could respond, a voice came from the shadows. You two really thought you could hide? They turned sharply. A man stepped out from behind a tree, one of Corran's lieutenants, his face covered in scars. He aimed a rifle straight at Mason. The director sends his regards, he said coldly. Lyra raised her gun, but the man fired first. Echo lunged faster than sight, knocking the soldier to the ground. The rifle clattered away. The man screamed as the predator pinned him down, growling inches from his face. Echo! Mason shouted, voice muffled by his wired jaw. The creature froze, breathing hard, but did not kill. Lyra quickly grabbed the rifle and stepped back. Mason knelt beside the soldier and wrote on a scrap of paper, "Where is Corran?" The man glared. You think he'll stop? He's building an army. You were just a test. The others... He coughed, eyes wide with fear, as Echo's growl deepened. He's making hundreds like that thing, he hissed, and they won't listen to you. They'll only listen to him. Lyra's face turned pale. He's cloning them, she whispered. Mason looked sick. The man smirked weakly. You can't stop it. You're already too late. Echo backed away as the man's breathing slowed. He was gone. Lyra looked at Mason. If what he said is true, then Echo's just one of many. Corran won't stop until he controls them all. Mason clenched his fists, anger flashing in his eyes. He wrote, then we make him fear the one he can't control. Lyra nodded slowly. We'll need allies. People outside the program, journalists, whistleblowers, maybe even rogue soldiers. If we can leak the truth, we can end him. Mason looked at Echo, who stood silently at the edge of the cave, staring into the dark forest. He's listening, she said softly. He understands more than we think. The next morning, they followed the river north again. The mist lifted as the sun rose, revealing the ruins of an old communication tower. Lyra smiled faintly. If we can power this up, we can send the files to the world, she said. They began working, connecting old wires, rebooting circuits. Hours passed. Finally, the signal light blinked green. It's working, she whispered. But before they could transmit, the ground shook. A deep rumble echoed through the cliffs. Mason looked up just in time to see a black aircraft descending through the clouds. No, Lyra gasped. The craft landed nearby, soldiers pouring out. At the center stood Corran himself, alive and furious. You're hard to kill, Instructor, he shouted, stepping forward. But it ends here. Mason and Lyra took cover behind the console. Echo growled low, his fur standing on end. Stay back, Lyra yelled, aiming her pistol. Corran laughed. You can't stop progress, Doctor. He raised a small device. One signal and your pet turns on you? He pressed the button. For a moment, Echo froze. His eyes flickered blue, body trembling. No, Lyra whispered. Fight it. Mason rushed forward, shouting hoarsely, Echo! The creature's body shook violently, caught between command and instinct. Then, with a roar that shook the mountains, Echo turned, not on Mason, but on Corran. The signal device sparked, melting in Corran's hand. The soldiers panicked as the predator tore through their ranks. Explosions lit the cliffs. Mason and Lyra ducked, shielding themselves from debris. When the dust settled, the aircraft was in flames. Corran lay motionless beside the wreck. Echo stood over him, chest heaving, eyes gold once more. Mason approached slowly, resting his hand on the creature's head. It's over, Lyra said softly. Mason nodded, but his eyes were distant. He looked at the wreck, then at the sky. No, he thought, it's only beginning. Because somewhere out there, more predators were being born, and he knew he would have to find them before someone worse did. The fire from the wreck still burned in the valley below, as Mason and Lyra stood in silence. The cold wind, carrying the smell of smoke through the cliffs. Echo paced beside them, restless, his golden eyes scanning the dark sky. Lyra's face was pale. "It's over," she whispered, but her voice trembled. "Corin is dead. The drones are gone. We can finally stop running." Mason didn't reply. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, where distant lights glowed faintly, military convoys moving toward the crash site. He shook his head slowly and wrote on his notepad, "It's not over. They'll send more." Lyra looked at him helplessly. "More?" she asked. "You think they'll still chase us after all this?" Mason met her eyes. Echo isn't the only one left, her breath caught. "You think the program survived?" Mason nodded. He pointed toward the mountains beyond the ridge. "Corin said they built hundreds. If that's true, someone else will take control now." Lyra stared at the ruined aircraft. "Then we have to stop them before they do." She looked at Echo, who stood silently at the edge of the cliff, the moonlight outlining his massive frame. "But how?" she whispered. Mason scribbled quickly, "We find the main facility. Destroy it." She shook her head in disbelief. "That's suicide." He looked at her, his expression calm and steady. "Then it's worth it." By dawn, they were already moving north. The terrain grew rougher, the air colder. Mason led the way through old logging trails, while Lyra monitored the scanner she salvaged from the wreck. "I've picked up a signal," she said, as they stopped by a frozen stream. "Encrypted transmission. Military frequency repeating coordinates." Mason raised a brow. "It's coming from an island offshore," she continued. "That must be where they moved the remaining subjects." Echo growled softly, ears twitching. Mason placed a hand on his shoulder. "We go there." Lyra sighed. "Do you ever stop?" He smiled faintly behind his damaged jaw and wrote, "Only when the truth ends." They reached the coast 2 days later. An abandoned dock stretched into the fog, where an old cargo ship sat rusting in the water. "Looks like it still floats," Lyra said, climbing aboard. Mason checked the fuel levels. "Barely enough for one trip." "Guess it's all or nothing," she muttered. Echo leapt onto the deck silently, his weight making the ship creak. They set sail into the grey dawn, the water dark and endless around them. Hours passed in silence until a dark shape appeared on the horizon, a fortress-like island surrounded by fences and watchtowers. "That's it," Lyra whispered. "Project Apex's heart." As they approached, spotlights swept across the sea. "They'll see us," she said, panic in her voice. Mason pointed to the water. "No," she whispered, realizing what he meant. "You can't be serious." But he was. They left the ship adrift and dove into the freezing waves. The current pulled them hard, but they kept moving, silent shadows beneath the surface. When they finally reached the island's edge, Mason climbed onto the rocks first, pulling Lyra up behind him. Echo emerged next, shaking water from his fur. "We're in," Lyra whispered, teeth chattering. Mason nodded and pointed toward a ventilation tunnel half buried in stone. They crawled inside. The tunnel led into a large underground hall filled with humming machines and glowing screens. Rows of tanks lined the walls, each containing creatures suspended in blue liquid. Lyra's face went pale. "Oh my God," she breathed. "They're alive!" Mason stared at them in horror. The hybrids inside were larger than Echo, with metal implants along their spines and cold, lifeless eyes. "They've been modifying them," she said softly. "No empathy, no emotion, just control." Echo let out a low growl that echoed through the hall. "Shh," Lyra whispered. "They'll hear us." But it was too late. An alarm began to blare. Doors slid open on the far side of the room, and soldiers flooded in. Mason grabbed a fallen weapon and motioned for Lyra to take cover. Gunfire filled the chamber. Echo charged forward, moving like lightning, knocking men aside with terrifying precision. Mason fired bursts to cover him, his mind racing. Lyra shouted, "We can't hold them! We need to shut down the system!" She ran toward the main control console, bullets sparking off metal around her. 30 seconds, she yelled. Mason nodded, fighting off another wave of guards. Echo leapt onto a walkway, roaring as he smashed through armored drones. The sound shook the walls. Lyra's fingers flew over the controls. Come on, she muttered. Override accepted. Red lights flashed across every tank. It's working, she shouted. But then a deep voice echoed through the speakers. You really think you can stop evolution? Mason froze. The voice was calm, smooth, familiar. Corin? Lyra gasped. The speakers crackled, and a holographic image flickered to life on the wall. Coran's face appeared scarred but alive. Did you really think I'd die so easily? He said, smiling coldly. You destroyed one base. I built 3 more. Project Apex is unstoppable. Mason's eyes burned with fury. Lyra shouted, You're killing innocent lives. You're turning them into slaves. Corin laughed. Innocent? These creatures were made for one purpose, to serve. Even that one beside you is no different. He looked at Echo. Activate Subject 0. A high-pitched tone filled the room. Echo froze, trembling. His eyes turned blue again. No! Lyra screamed. Mason ran toward him, grabbing his arm. Fight it! He shouted hoarsely. Echo's muscles tightened, claws scraping against the floor. Corin's voice purred. He's mine now. But then something unexpected happened. Echo looked at Mason, and instead of attacking, he turned toward the control tanks. With a roar that shook the island, he smashed through the machinery, tearing wires and panels apart. Sparks exploded, flames rising as the tanks cracked open. Corin's image flickered wildly. What are you doing? He shouted. Lyra hit the emergency override. He's shutting everything down, she yelled. Explosions rippled through the facility as alarms screamed. Mason grabbed Lyra's hand. We need to move, he shouted. They ran through collapsing corridors, fire chasing them down. Echo stayed behind, holding off drones and soldiers. Lyra screamed, Mason, he's not coming. Mason turned, tears burning in his eyes. Echo stood in the flames, watching them one last time. The creature growled softly, almost like a goodbye. The blast threw them off their feet and everything went black. When Mason opened his eyes, he was lying on the beach, smoke rising from the island behind him. Lyra was beside him, coughing weakly. He did it, she whispered, voice breaking. Mason sat up slowly, staring at the distant fire. He saved us, she said, tears in her eyes. Mason nodded silently. The ocean wind blew across his face as he wrote on his notepad, No, he saved everyone, far beyond the smoke. In the last flicker of fire, a shadow moved through the waves, gold eyes glinting before vanishing into the sea. Mason watched the horizon, a small smile crossing his bruised face. For the first time there was peace, but deep inside he knew one truth. If humanity ever repeated its mistake, Echo would return, not as a weapon, but as the world's guardian. The morning after the island explosion, the sea was calm again. Smoke drifted slowly across the horizon, while waves lapped quietly at the shore. Mason sat on a rock, staring at the ruins in the distance, his bandaged hands resting on his knees. Lyra stood nearby, holding the last remaining data drive, the only surviving proof of Project Apex. He's really gone, she whispered, her voice breaking. Mason didn't respond. He simply watched the water, eyes distant, as if expecting a golden glow to rise from the waves. For a moment the world was silent. Then Lyra said softly, He saved us, Mason. You gave him a choice, and he chose to be free. Mason nodded, but deep down he wasn't sure if Echo was truly gone. Something about that creature felt eternal, like the ocean itself. Days passed as they hid in an abandoned fishing village along the coast. The news spread fast. Island facility destroyed in unexplained blast. Governments denied involvement. Military patrols swarmed the waters, searching for survivors. They're covering it up, Lyra said angrily, throwing a newspaper down. They called it an accident. Mason picked it up, reading the headline carefully. The article mentioned no names, no experiments, nothing about the creatures. He took his notepad and wrote, That means the others are still out there. Lyra frowned. Others? Mason, the entire island exploded. He looked at her steadily. They had more facilities. Corin said 3. Her heart sank. You think more of those hybrids survived? Mason nodded grimly. Lyra sat down, rubbing her temples. Then we have to find them before the military does. She opened her laptop and connected the data drive. This file is damaged, she said, scrolling through lines of corrupted code, but maybe I can still pull coordinates. Mason stood behind her, scanning the flickering screen. Suddenly, one set of numbers appeared clear. Sector 9, Arctic Outpost. Oh no, she murmured. That's in the frozen north. Mason wrote, then that's where we go. Lyra looked up sharply. You can't be serious. We barely made it out alive last time. He gave her a small, tired smile. If we don't, it will start again. 2 weeks later, they stood aboard a small cargo plane heading north. The world below was white and endless, ice stretching as far as the eye could see. The pilot, an old smuggler Lyra had bribed, shouted over the engine noise, "You two must be crazy. No one goes near that sector." Mason stayed silent, his eyes focused on the snowy expanse. Lyra leaned closer. He's right, Mason. We don't know what's waiting for us down there. He took out his notepad and wrote, "Then we'll find out together." She sighed, shaking her head, but smiled faintly. You and your stubborn hope. When the plane landed on the ice, the cold hit them like a wall. The wind howled and snow whipped around their faces. In the distance, a black structure rose from the frozen wasteland, a research base half buried in ice. That's it, Lyra said, pulling her hood tight. They trudged across the snow, their breaths freezing in the air. When they reached the entrance, Mason forced the frozen door open. Inside, the base was eerily silent, dim lights flickering over walls lined with frost. No guards, Lyra whispered. Too quiet. Mason motioned for her to stay behind as he moved deeper inside. The halls were filled with old equipment, broken cages and shattered glass. Whatever was here. They abandoned it fast, Lyra said. Then she froze. Mason, look. On the wall was a message scrawled in red paint. They woke up. The words sent a chill through her. Mason turned, hearing a faint sound, something like breathing. He raised his flashlight. The beam revealed deep claw marks along the metal floor. Lyra's voice trembled. Something's still here. A growl echoed through the corridor, low and heavy. Mason's hand tightened on his rifle. We're not alone, she whispered. A dark shape moved in the shadows, massive and slow. The light flickered, and there it was. A creature twice Echo's size, with metal plating fused into its skin, eyes glowing icy blue. It stood upright, intelligent but cold. It's one of them, Lyra whispered, backing away. The creature tilted its head, studying them. Mason raised his hand slowly. Easy, he said softly through his wide jaw. We're not enemies. For a moment it hesitated. Then the intercom crackled. A deep voice filled the room. Welcome back, instructor. Mason froze. The voice was unmistakable. Corin, Lyra gasped. He's alive? The speakers hissed with static. You destroyed my creation once, but I learned from it, Corin said coldly. Now they answer only to me. The hybrid roared, charging forward. Mason shoved Lyra aside as the creature slammed into the wall, crushing metal. The fight was chaos. Gunfire, claws, and sparks filled the air. Mason fired point blank, but bullets barely slowed it. Lyra hacked into the nearby console, shouting, Mason! I can overload the core, but we have to lure it in. Mason nodded and waved his arm to draw the creature's attention. It lunged at him, tearing through pipes and wires. Now, Lyra, he shouted. She slammed the final command. Alarms blared, and red lights flashed as the floor began to crack from the heat of the reactor below. Mason ran toward her, but the creature caught his leg, dragging him down. He punched it desperately, struggling to break free. Mason! Lyra screamed. Then a thunderous roar echoed. The walls shook. A blur of gold crashed through the flames. Echo, he was alive. The predator slammed into the hybrid, their claws colliding in a storm of fury and sparks. Mason could hardly believe it. Echo, he whispered. The two beasts fought like titans. Ice shattered, steel melted, and the floor gave way beneath them. Echo pushed the other hybrid into the collapsing reactor chamber. Go! Lyra shouted, pulling Mason toward the exit. They stumbled through the snow as the entire facility exploded behind them. A shockwave knocked them to the ground. When the smoke cleared, the base was gone, replaced by a burning crater. Lyra coughed, helping Mason sit up. He saved us again, she said softly. Mason stared at the crater, tears mixing with snow. He saved everyone, he said. As the wind howled across the ice, Mason saw something move in the distance, a golden figure walking slowly into the white horizon. He watched silently as Echo vanished into the snowstorm, leaving no footprints behind. "What now?" Lyra asked quietly. Mason smiled faintly, his voice rough but steady. "Now," he said, "we make sure no one ever builds another one." They turned and walked away as the storm swallowed the ruins behind them. Above the clouds, the morning sun broke through, shining over the frozen land. And somewhere out there, hidden among the mountains and snow, the world's most powerful predator watched over them, not as a weapon, not as a monster, but as a guardian born from humanity's greatest mistake, now free to decide its own destiny forever.